Hello and welcome aboard, ladies and gentlemen. This is your host, Captain Kibbs, signing on today, and today we're going to be talking about Part 3 of the Bandit Kingdoms. Now, in Part 2, the last where we'd left off is the reconstruction and rebuilding of the Star League. Not only that, but the death of Cameron is where we ended up, death of Simon Cameron. The last notable Cameron who wouldn't be absolutely ass. His son, Richard Cameron, as you all know, probably by now, he's got a bit of shaky ground. Some people pity him, some people hate him, but that's a story for another time when we talk about the House of Camerons. But now we're moving on into the next part of the lore. And in this part of the lore, basically upon Simon's death, every major house began accusing each other. Not entirely initially, while it was an accident. There were certain people that claimed that the Lyrian Commonwealth murdered him. I mean, he was just outside the border of the Lyrian Commonwealth in RimWorld space. And some people even pointed their fingers at the Periphery states themselves, such as the Taurian Concordat, being that they were the most violent of any of the factions in the Periphery, saying that they must have murdered him. They could pull off a plot like this because they're so, dastardly like that. And the Lyrian Commonwealth wasn't able to escape this either because their current leader was also known for being a little bit power grabby. And the other houses, including Dracona's Combine, Free Worlds League, and even House Davion on the other side of the fucking inner sphere, which is along with the Taurian Concordat, by the way. Those two are on the other side of the sphere. Everybody got their fair share of blame, but even the craziest people didn't really blame the RimWorld's Republic, mostly because of their staunch support. And again, bearing in mind that most of the RimWorld's Republic was able to successfully suppress these revolts, so the public and most of the Periphery states other Periphery states and the Inner Sphere states didn't quite know that the public in the RimWorld's Republic was actually very much like the rest of the public populace throughout the other Periphery states, and they very much opposed the Inner Sphere power, aka the Star League. So no one really suspected that could have been them, not to mention that the Amarises for such a long time had been such staunch allies, and never really outspokenly, voicing their opinions against the Star League. And a little bit to touch up on that, because this is important, because it is the Amarises who did end up killing him. I mean, there's so much evidence and stuff pointing to him, we're just going to say that the Amarises did it. Because the Amarises, there's no reason they wouldn't have wanted to do that, and while it may have looked like an accident, even some of the Periphery states begin to acknowledge the fact that it's very possible that it was the RimWorld's Republic. It makes sense. It adds up. There is a lot to suggest it. Now, it might have been happenstance that did happen, but again, I highly doubt that. Bearing in mind that their feud goes back to the First Succession War, or not the Succession War, pardon, the Reunification Wars. When the Amarises pledged their loyalty to the Star League, the House of Amaris was under siege, and the Star League didn't actually come to help them. In fact, they waited to the last bit of the Reunification Wars, waited till all the other three major campaigns, the Outworlds Alliance, the Taurian Concordat, and the Magistracy of Canopus were brought to heel. Then they finally went and relieved Amaris, who was stuck in his fortifications for the last few friggin' years. And not only that, but they then placed him under house arrest for 2 decades. You can kind of see that, and he just sort of was left to rot. You can kind of see why the Amarises became to despise them, and so much so that not only that, but their power was kind of stripped away, and the Camerons didn't really, in their eyes, repay them, and the Camerons didn't feel like they needed to. Again, merely dismissing them as nobodies for the most part, like everyone else at this point. The only reason why they're so relevant now, and why we don't talk about the other minor interstellar governments who were shoved aside as nobodies, is because they didn't pull off what Amaris pulled off, which was basically just single-handedly destroying the Star League and the House of Camerons, the most powerful house to have ever graced the sphere. And that's all on that. Now, we do need to talk a little bit about Richard Cameron. Richard Cameron was the son of Simon Cameron, and he lost his mother only a year before his father's death. So, he was already kind of shut in at this point. And upon hearing the news and discovering his father's death, that he just sort of kind of closed himself off from the world. He became very emotional, unhinged, slightly depressed, anxiety, which made him kind of a nightmare to deal with. So very few people in the court of the Star League wanted to deal with it, and even the great houses were just going to try to manipulate him. So the great protector of the realm, who was announced as Commander Kerensky upon Simon Cameron's death to basically watch over and regent for the young boy, was charged with also taking care of him. Now, Kerensky later on will talk about and more so in the Star League history and Kerensky's history, but we'll talk about this now because it is relevant. In some of his letters, he does talk a lot about regret, about some of the letters that were successfully recovered. Bear in mind, a lot of the information is kind of vague at this point, and especially between Kerensky, Amaris, and the Cameron. That stuff is getting a little bit vague because not a lot of the records survived the succession wars. But some of the letters, Kerensky goes on to talk about how he felt great shame and he felt terrible because he failed Simon Cameron and he failed Richard Cameron in guiding the boy to, be a good man. In one instance, he had a conversation with Richard, and he was talking about, what is it to be noble? He's trying to just figure out, what the boy thinks of what noble is. He's like, being noble is being born noble. And then he asked him, like, well, wouldn't it be possible if, a peasant to become a noble? Wouldn't he be able to do noble actions? He's like, no, that's impossible. And the reason why he said, no, it's impossible is because Stefan Amaris at this point had been, poisoning his mind to think against him. And even at this point, Kerensky very much started to hate Stefan Amaris in the court. And Kerensky and Amaris would sort of fight over the boy in sort of off the hand sort of like things. But again, Amaris was able to win because he was able to kick off the independence wars and the Periphery and the Taurian Concordat and the Magistracy of Canopus and the Outworlds Alliance, which sort of forced Kerensky to abandon the boy for other things. And even then, before then, he had trouble being able to keep in contact with the boy because of all the stuff that was going on in the Star League. I mean, you had the great houses, the high court, the court lords from the inner sphere powers were, basically stripping the Star League of its power at this point. In fact, a lot of their power began to get kneecapped because the protector couldn't quite keep full grasp of the situation. And as this continually happened, the Star League began to, recess further and further into sort of a weaker and weaker state, while the inner sphere states actually began to build up their militaries, which is why the succession wars happened as soon as they did. Because at this point, the inner sphere states are starting to slowly rebuild their militaries because they have the opportunity to do so. And they're getting some level, but not very much, but some level of self-autonomy back. Now, while this is going on, you also have a bunch of other things happening. Now, we do need to talk a little bit about Richard Cameron. Richard Cameron was the son of Simon Cameron, and he lost his mother only a year before his father's death. So, he was already kind of shut in at this point. And upon hearing the news and discovering his father's death, that he just sort of kind of closed himself off from the world. He became very emotional, unhinged, slightly depressed, anxiety, which made him kind of a nightmare to deal with. So very few people in the court of the Star League wanted to deal with it, and even the great houses were just going to try to manipulate him. So the great protector of the realm, who was announced as Commander Kerensky upon Simon Cameron's death to basically watch over and regent for the young boy, was charged with also taking care of him. Now, Kerensky later on will talk about and more so in the Star League history and Kerensky's history, but we'll talk about this now because it is relevant. In some of his letters, he does talk a lot about regret, about some of the letters that were successfully recovered. Bear in mind, a lot of the information is kind of vague at this point, and especially between Kerensky, Amaris, and the Cameron. That stuff is getting a little bit vague because not a lot of the records survived the succession wars. But some of the letters, Kerensky goes on to talk about how he felt great shame and he felt terrible because he failed Simon Cameron and he failed Richard Cameron in guiding the boy to, be a good man. In one instance, he had a conversation with Richard, and he was talking about, what is it to be noble? He's trying to just figure out, what the boy thinks of what noble is. He's like, being noble is being born noble. And then he asked him, like, Well, wouldn't it be possible if, a peasant to become a noble? Wouldn't he be able to do noble actions? He's like, no, that's impossible. And the reason why he said, no, it's impossible is because Stefan Amaris at this point had been, poisoning his mind to think against him. And even at this point, he very much started to hate Stefan Amaris in the court. And Kerensky and Amaris would sort of fight over the boy in sort of off the hand sort of like things. But again, Amaris was able to win because he was able to kick off the Independence Wars and the Periphery and the Taurian Concordat and the Magistracy of Canopus and the Outworlds Alliance, which sort of forced Kerensky to abandon the boy for other things. And even then, before then, he had trouble being able to keep in contact with the boy because of all the stuff that was going on in the Starleague. I mean, you had the great houses, the High Court, the court lords from the Inner Sphere powers were, basically stripping the Starleague of its power at this point. In fact, a lot of their power began to get kneecapped because the Protector couldn't quite keep full grasp of the situation. And as this continually happened, the Starleague began to, recess further and further into sort of a weaker and weaker state, while the Inner Sphere states actually began to build up their militaries, which is why the Succession Wars happened as soon as they did. Because at this point, the Inner Sphere states are starting to slowly rebuild their militaries because they have the opportunity to do so. And they're getting some level, but not very much, but some level of self-autonomy back. Now, while this is going on, you also have a bunch of other things happening. Now, there's two things we quickly need to note here. Simon Cameron gave the Periphery some hope. However, he may have increased the fortifications to those massive fortifications throughout the Periphery, which did piss them off quite a bit, but he did reduce the amount of installations there were, thus sort of withdrawing back into more fortress-like areas. And while that kind of pissed off the Periphery, he was a man who was willing to work with the Periphery and was going to treat them like equals, and which is why he went on a tour through the Periphery, or attempted to go into a tour through the Periphery to, be like, I care about you guys. I will work with you. We will make this work. We will make it beneficial for both of us to be in the Starleague. And that tour failed, so that lost a lot of hope after Simon Cameron's death. And with the Regency government in place, this is going to be the second huge kicker now. Following Simon Cameron's death, the Regency government took power and would pass a extremely burdening taxation edict on the Periphery, much like Michael Cameron, one of their predecessors, had done before, which had, sparked a lot of outrage. Outcry and outrage throughout the entire Periphery, just fucking excoriated the Starleague taxation edict. And they didn't quite know, this is also important, they didn't know that the Protector of the Realm, it required his signature, Commander Kerensky. He didn't sign it, and I don't recall if he knows about it at this point, because you got to bear in mind, the lore gets a little bit hazy here. You got people saying very conflicting things. I personally believe he did not know about it at all, which is why it sort of happened while he was touring the Periphery. And while he was touring the Periphery, every world he went to was like having massive outcries and protests against him, because they thought he did it. They thought that this was his idea, and he did not sign that document. Now, again, whether you believe he chose to not sign it or not, I honestly would suggest to you to think that his entire role and intentions were to keep the Starleague together and never to cause it any sort of strife. And he was already overburdened as is, now being the Protector of the Realm, and you had this crisis in the Periphery, which was forcing him all over the sphere, all over colonized space around the edges of it. So he was barely able to keep in contact with Richard. He did try, writing to Richard, but again, Richard was in a very bad state, and Richard's personality and mental state, continued to deteriorate without him. And this is a real shame, because the only person who could actually reach Richard right now would be Kerensky, because Richard did trust Kerensky quite a bit, still at this point. And if there was anybody who was going to break through and uncover what Amaris was sort of fucking poisoning him, it would have been Kerensky. But again, he was too busy trying to hold the Starleague together. There was so much going on that it's just impossible. In 2753 and in 2754, the hike in violence and and Star League installations and personnel in the Periphery against them increased drastically. And this is sort of when the tour was taking place. Now, the hatred that poured on the SLDF was not only just massive. You have to bear in mind that they were, it wasn't just like graffiti, slander. I mean, there were riots. There were, political assassinations. There was groups and going around assassinating commanders and officials. So tensions at this point were rising. Even TV culture in the Periphery. This is interesting, by the way. Records did survive of this. TV culture and culture in general, their cinema, their news, encouraged these actions. So the Periphery is not innocent here. The Periphery immediately jumped the gun, immediately assumed Kerensky did this, immediately assumed the SLDF was behind it, the Star League. Who was really behind this was the High Regency Council, which is the High Lords of the Inner Sphere powers. Amaris, Davian, or not Amaris, pardon. Davian, Kirita, all of them. They passed this edict because they wanted to get that money, because this money was partially siphoned to the Star League, but it was mostly being siphoned to the great powers in the Inner Sphere. And this coincides with their military build-ups. So you've got a lot of things taking place here, and things are getting convoluted. And so we're just going to, kind of gloss over a few of them, because again, we'll end up going into these in a lot more detail through the Star League thing when we're just explicitly talking about this. But again, we're trying to stay focused to the Periphery. Now, this ties into the Periphery because you're going to have Amaris, who is going to start going around, because he's also, by the way, thing that a lot of people didn't know, and that we know now, is that he was the one buying up those mechs. Those mechs that were disappearing, that Simon Cameron figured out that he's like, something's going on here. Someone is instigating something. And there's a huge discrepancy in some mech purchases and like where they're going. Nobody knows. Amaris has these mechs, and he's been going around giving deals to all the other Periphery lords. None of the Periphery lords quite trust him, but again, they're going to start looking at him with a little bit more of a positive light because he has something they want. And so he starts giving them to the Taurian Concordat and the Magistracy, and is like, yes, when the time is right, we'll strike. Remember, he's playing a double blind trick here. He's basically like, oh yes, I'm on your side, Richard. Oh yes, I'm on your side, Periphery. But honestly, Stefan Amaris, is not a liberator. Some people in the Periphery, not very many anymore now that the knowledge has come out in later days, do not see Amaris as the savior or a liberator, because he was a madman. He was a greedy man. Now, he wasn't like evil for no reason. He started out with, relatively reasonable goals to basically just get vengeance for all the problems that he has to suffer every day. All the shame, the humiliation his family has bore because of the Camerons has sort of festered in every Amaris born after. And so this is continuing to grow. And as this sort of thing grew, as time went on, Amaris eventually began the second element of his plot. And that plot part was to basically begin spinning the media, fake news, go figure, how relevant is that? Basically spinning it as he's, this one man against the entire High Lords, trying to protect the young boy, Richard Cameron, from the corruption and the utter filth that had festered in Terra. And basically, he was trying to safeguard the Star League, and he was trying to protect Richard. He was the fatherly figure, protecting Richard's mind and heart and soul and all that beautiful stuff. And he would basically continue to spin this media. And the reason why he was able to spin the media this way was because his influence over Richard and over the court of Terra had grown so much. And he also, in other things, he would say like, after witnessing all these things, I began to question myself and my loyalties to the, Terra. Is it truly pure and things like that? And later on, he'd go on to say stuff like, no, the future of mankind's honor and nobility lies in the Periphery. The Inner Sphere has become corrupted and decadent and things like of that nature. Now, plenty of people wanted to believe this. Believe you me, at this point, with the taxation edict, the rise in violence and, terrorism and things like that, people, and it's been going on for years, and it was getting only worse. People wanted to latch on to any hope. And people the common folk were very easy to latch on to the idea of Amaris, trying to protect Richard. I mean, it sounds like a noble romantic story of, heroism and bravery against all odds as this one Periphery Lord attempts to, talk to the First Lord and try to protect him from these things and these elements. But he kept spinning the media and out of sight, out of mind everywhere else as he was, and Richard was slowly going further and further over, and, he was continually trying to save him. Meanwhile, all the while, pledging his loyalty to Richard to his face and, corrupting him. He was the corrupting influence. Even the many High Lords began to realize that he was actually far worse. But even none of them had imagined what he was going to do. They just thought he was going to get more power and more money. And they had tried to reach out to the First Lord, but they'd already burned up their trust with the First Lord. And so they lost that. And with, Kerensky also losing the First Lord's trust as well, things just sort of continued to fall out of alignment, as basically only Amaris would be the only one he would trust. Now, everyone in the inner sphere kind of didn't believe this as much. I mean, you had common folks who would, but in the Periphery, a lot more common folks did believe this. However, in the Periphery, the High Lords were much more skeptical of this, and obviously didn't quite trust Amaris, considering how much he'd praised Mother Terra so much beforehand. However, Amaris decided that he would tour the Periphery, discussing this distressful situation with them, and upon touring, he basically began making his secret alliances. There was one instance where he met the Taurian Concordat, and this went for both not only the Taurian Concordat, but the Outworlds Alliance and the Magistracy of Canopus, where he basically went to them and was like, yeah, I can get you several battalions of battle mechs, and I can make sure that nobody knows where they are, and I can get you all the weapons and equipment you need to begin the preparations to start your revolution. But basically, he also spun it in a way that he was still, like the media had portrayed him, in a positive light. He went with the media. So instead of being like that, he's like, I need to make sure mankind's safe, I gotta protect the Periphery and stuff like that. And while they still didn't trust him too much, he's like, I will try to dissuade Richard Cameron, if possible, but if worst case comes to worst case, we need to fight back. And of course, the High Lords, or not the High Lords, but the Periphery High Lords, if you will, kind of did buy into that. Like, well, yeah, he has a lot to gain from this. And they didn't really question it too much. Now, this is precisely what Simon Cameron had feared. Basically, there was this entity that was going around stirring things up, and that was Amaris. Simon Cameron was right. Simon Cameron knew that there was some element that was wrong, which leads me to believe that Simon Cameron was assassinated. It was not an accident, but he was actually assassinated by Amaris and his goons in the Rimworld space on that mining colony, which sort of leads to this whole cataclysmic events of things that just continue to spiral out of control. It makes perfect sense, as everything seems to line up that way. Now, as time would go on, basically the situation would continue to deteriorate. So much so that there were mass resignations within the BSLA. And these resignations had to stem from the rise in taxation to various other edicts and things that Richard Cameron had proposed and basically done to the Periphery. These mass resignations would harm the BSLA, and the BSLA, being that it dealt with the Periphery states, it made it crucial that it would be intact during this period, and it wasn't. It was crumbling, and the worst part of it all was Amaris began replacing it with people who were loyal to him. So there were people now in the BSLA who were loyal to House Amaris and the Rimworld's Republic that could stir things up further. However, he would assure the other Periphery Lords while this was happening, like, no, don't worry, I'll make sure that this will actually lead to a peaceful secession. We won't have to worry about conflict. Now, obviously, that would actually not be the case, as time would prove. And with Richard's birthday proclamation withdrawing all SLDF forces from Rimworld space, that was proven to be the case. Reaction across the Periphery was complete outrage at the sudden betrayal of Amaris, the supposed savior. Now they referred to him again as the bootlicker Amaris, who was, basically undermining the Periphery to get Cameron's favoritism, to basically get, special status as kind of almost treated like an inner sphere state. And for the most part, the Rimworld's Republic was actually treated like an inner sphere state at this point. with the withdrawal of all SLDF forces, meaning SLDF forces did not, take the taxes. Because bear in mind, with some of the edicts that were passed, SLDF troops were not paid with Terran hegemony taxes or inner sphere taxes. Garrison forces were paid with Periphery taxes. That and resources from the Periphery, meaning that they did not at all hamper the economy of the inner sphere nor the Terran hegemony. This was one of the big things that made these garrisons hated. Because remember, while the Periphery is attached to the inner sphere, the Periphery still has to worry about pirate raids from further within the deep Periphery. Because mankind, we don't know how far it goes out there, but it's estimated that it goes even past the clan space, which is even further out than that. So nobody knows how vastly colonized mankind has been. Because again, lots of information has been lost and nobody quite knows. And not to mention, mankind continually expands outward, so we can only assume that the Periphery is only just a fucking dot on the map at this point. Now, the other lords, and I mean this in the Periphery, started to suspect Amaris of a double-blind maneuver. A very, very elaborate double-blind, basically where he is handing the Periphery on a platter, yet again, to the inner sphere to basically lose their autonomy even more, by using this as, casus belli and justification to further yet take away their autonomy because of this outrage and all these riots and protests, and basically get his Periphery area more power and more money and resources because of it, because he handed them into Cameron Richard's hands. Now, this elaborate double blind was even, could you even say it's a triple blind? By the way, BattleTech loves these double blinds. You have no idea. Double blinds are done repeatedly, and that's basically where, you have a character or a person who tricks both sides into doing what he wants for the benefit of himself. And double blinds are a frequent political maneuver in BattleTech universe. And Amaris, it's important to note this, because Amaris actually made the double blind a popularized political movement, or a political plot. And you'll see a lot of people take inspiration from Amaris' things. Now, the thing is, no one actually can pull off it the same way, because again, Amaris did it first, and therefore he was able to do it the most successful. So pulling off a double blind is a lot harder, because again, Amaris made it a fucking legend to pull off that kind of maneuver. And he basically made it from like this minor, like basic, oh yeah, double blind, to like a double blind is like this thing. I mean, Amaris fucking not only fucking fooled the Periphery, he fooled the inner sphere, he fooled Richard Cameron, he fooled everyone. Now, there were some people he didn't fool as much towards the end. Obviously, the High Lords at this point are like, okay, this fucker is not gonna, get the fucking Richard Cameron off our hands as an annoyance. He's basically corrupted him and now using him as a puppet boy king. And things would just continue, as they already are. Things are just spiraling out of control. It is, at this point, irreversible. The only way to really stop this plot would be to put a bullet in Amaris, and no one is going to do that because Richard is friends with Amaris, and that means that Amaris gets, unlimited protection. So things have spiraled out of control. We are now in the act of the final death throes of the Star League. Now, the Star League would hold this thing called Operation Persuasive. As one might guess, they basically had military exercises along the border and in some of the installations in the Periphery. And with the idea of Operation Persuasive was to basically bring the Periphery's, heightened level of terrorism, heightened level of outcries and outrage to a calm. That was Kerensky's attempt to bring order back. And actually, surprisingly, Kerensky succeeded. It actually restored order. However, on the flip side of this movement, of this exercise, you had Stefan Amaris who would be like, he'd start touting like, oh, this is cruel, how could you do this to the Periphery, and he'd be touting that kind of stuff. Now, again, at this point, people are kind of wishy-washy on Amaris, and Amaris, like, yeah, well, at least he's, not on the other guy's side. Everyone sort of looks at Amaris as sort of an incompetent buffoon, and they always kind of will. It won't be until his act is finally revealed that they'll actually, go like, oh shit, what have we done? Now, Richard Cameron wouldn't just be sitting idly by being a puppet. He'd be pushing down edicts, but these edicts would always be influenced by Amaris. For example, the Taxation Edict of 2763 would actually prove to light that, that was probably an Amaris idea. But basically, he raised the taxes on the Periphery again. And recently, he had also tried tax or Edict 156, if I recall correctly, which was to ban all house militaries. Now, of course, the houses did not want to do that, and at this point, Richard Cameron has he declared himself a tyrant. Now, every First Lord would always adhere to the council, the High Lord councils of the Inner Sphere. And so it was kind of like, a noble aristocracy, but the First Lord would never really, be a tyrant. He would never be dictatorial and just go around doing too many things. I mean, there was Michael Cameron, who is obviously much more dictatorial, but no one was quite on the level of Richard Cameron. Richard Cameron had violated a lot of things and basically declared himself the, true ruler. He's like, you will obey me or you will fucking get out of here. He wasn't going around executing people, but, you definitely wouldn't want to push him because you wouldn't quite put it past the boy to do something like that. He has, again, become quite unhinged in his warped view of what nobility and justice looks like is about as accurate as, I don't even know, some of our politicians that we have today. It's just absolutely ass backwards. If you are, again, a peasant, you can never become a noble. No matter what you do, you will always be of low-born status. It is up to the nobles to determine what is right and what is wrong. You have no say on that, and you cannot ever have a say on that. Which is kind of weird that he thinks that, considering, and again, many other people had tried to tell him this, well, how does one become a noble then? Well, they always were a noble. It's like, they were always a noble? He has a very flawed logic, and he's very rigid in this perspective. And the reason why he's unwilling to compromise on all these issues is because, again, from a very early childhood, his parents had instilled him the greatness of House Camerons, the nobilities, the things like that. They didn't want to tell him the darker things just yet, the failings of the house, the failings of the lineage, the failings of Michael Cameron, and so on and so forth. They wanted to postpone that till he was a more older age, and they didn't really want to disturb the boy yet with that. Normally with Camerons, they'd tell them when they were older about, we have a responsibility and, all these things and that. But Richard Cameron, had always had a fascination for knights doing chivalrous things and heroic deeds and tales, and he wanted to be that hero. He wanted to be those legends his parents had told him, and even Stefan Amaris had told him and reinforced in him. A Periphery Lord, no less, of, his parents and how great the Camerons were. Now, that obviously was not the case, and while there were great Camerons, there were also bad Camerons, and Richard Cameron was not able to he was unable to comprehend this concept. It wasn't so much so that he was just, unable to, reason. I mean, that was part of the thing, but he was being brainwashed at this point into thinking this sort of way. And as a 6-year-old boy, he was unable to quite establish his own personality as a very confused and sheltered child. Now, again, you can always blame Richard Cameron because, he did grow up and, he still did these things, but Stefan Amaris had always been there from the start, and he already was very troubled. Again, I cannot stress how troubled this boy was. This boy was fucked up when his mom died. And then his father went on tour, right? And so he was already kind of a shut-in. And it was hard to reach him as is, but, he still had his father, and the rest of the family was kind of there, and he wasn't quite unbearable. Then his dad died, and then he just completely shut himself off from the world. He shut himself off from his family. He just locked himself up. He locked up. He couldn't handle it. He was incapable. He was weak, whatever you want to call him, but he was unable to handle the fact that he had lost his mother and father in a very short span. And that bolstered by the fact that you had Amaris come in to become this fatherly figure who had all these things that Richard liked, and he immediately just did the candy trick, where he just look at all these nice things, instead of telling him hard truths and things like this, and that the boy was, not ready for, that his family had already tried to tell him. Not to dilute too much to Richard Cameron, but again, this whole fucking segment of the Periphery origin story matters because, again, I have to stress that it's going to basically influence what we're going to be doing next. Well, as how the Periphery will form out. And this will change up quite a bit. Now, we're going to have the next big thing, which is going to be some preparations, which are... Now, all the while, you had Kerensky trying to do what Simon Cameron had done, sort of try to pick up the pieces where he left off. He was still kind of, not as much in the know that Simon Cameron had been with all of his intelligence gathering and all that stuff, but Kerensky was starting to figure out stuff. He was like, all right, something's going on here, and things have been building up for a point, and Simon Cameron, was doing something, and then he got killed, and everything started to begin to line up. However, this thought of process, or this entire fucking uncovering of stuff, was stopped. And it was stopped very conveniently by the Freedom Army, which was basically the groups of unofficial supported rebels or terrorist groups that were supported unofficially by the Periphery governments, and them rising up and causing all sorts of mayhem and problems, distracted Kerensky from this and pulled him actually from the Court of Terror and from being able to look at any of these things permanently. And from this point onwards, Kerensky would have his hands full dealing with rebels. And Puppy has now decided to interrupt the lore video. What a great Puppy. Really? You're gonna do that here? You're gonna chew on a bone? You little bastard? That's okay. Maybe Puppy's onto something. Maybe Puppy knows that we are reaching the point when the coup is actually gonna happen. And now that I look at how long I've been talking, holy Christ, we're not even at the coup yet. Holy smoly. We need to, we can't skim the rest, because that's too important. Oh, we're going to have to do all of it. Well, I guess we'll call this here. This has been another excellent lore video with the house Captain Kibbs, but, holy smoke-a-rollies, got so fucking caught up in talking about this shit that I completely had forgotten the time. My goodness. My goodness, bearing in mind that I'm, a little rusty when it comes to the BattleTech lore, I've forgotten how crazy it was just on the origins of the Bandit Kingdoms, crying out loud. But then again, we're getting tied down with the Star League Civil War, and this shit, like I said, is not only a phenomenal read, just reading up about the Star League incident and how much shit was going on during the fall of the Star League is absolutely amazing. The one thing I wish the Horus Heresy had was, not to complain too much about other science fiction universe or the Clone Wars had, was the amount of depth that the BattleTech universe has. It makes no sense, you'd think, like a little mech tabletop game, really? Of all the things, would have such a kick-ass and probably one of the best betrayal stories of all time? Maybe. It's so well written. It really is, and that's the problem when we get into the later segments of lore and when we start going over other things, going like, yeah, this is when another company picked it up and started writing the lore, and now it's gonna be crap, because it's sort of lost sight of what it was, and basically you have Kerensky 2.0, and you have the whole fucking wall thing, and the Devlin stone, the wall is coming down. Devlin, when the wall comes down, the world, or the fucking civilization will end. Herp-de-derp-de-derp, doomsday crap. Anyways, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, this is the house Captain Kibbs signing off. And if you like these videos, let me know. I need you guys to... God, really? Hey, Puppy, can you hold on a second? Abby. Yeah, you. That's who I'm talking to. I'm talking to you, Fluffy Bee. Now, Fluffy Bee. Hold that thought. Okay, I'm just finishing my outro. Okay. Alright. I'm watching you. So yeah, that kind of wraps up today's video. Now, I've got a ton of more stuff to do, and by the way, we will be starting, surprise, surprise, Fallout lore is coming as well. And I see that, but either way, it is apparent that it is now time for me to go. Anyways, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you appreciate these lore videos, or at least, at the very least, enjoy them. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to talk to me personally on the matter, be sure to head on over to the Discord link in the description. Then you can come on over, say hi, we can have a chit-chat about stuff. Stuff like that. But without further ado, I'll see you all in the next video. So have a good one, guys.